When the World Cup began, most people expected the biggest debates to be about goals, VAR, and referees. But just a few weeks later, one of the most controversial topics of the tournament turned out to be a water break. Just 3 minutes. No goal. No red card. No penalty. Yet it sparked protests from coaches. Fans booed from the stands. Broadcasters faced criticism. And now UEFA has publicly refused to follow FIFA's lead. How did a decision that seemed so small become one of the biggest controversies of the tournament? What makes this story different is not the 3-minute break itself. It is the people arguing about it. On one side is FIFA, the organization that runs the World Cup and oversees the biggest tournament on the planet. On the other side is UEFA, the governing body behind the Champions League, the European Championship, and many of the most prestigious club competitions in world football. Normally, when FIFA tests a major change at the World Cup, the rest of the football world watches closely. Many innovations introduced in past tournaments eventually became standard across the sport. But this time, the reaction from Europe has been very different. UEFA has not publicly attacked FIFA. It has not launched a campaign against the idea. Instead, it looked at what has been happening during World Cup 2026 and reached its own conclusion. That conclusion is remarkably simple. UEFA will not adopt the same model for the Champions League. It also has no plans to introduce it at Euro 2028. That was the moment this debate moved beyond a technical rule change. It became a debate about how football should be managed in the future. And that is what makes this story so significant. If you only look at FIFA's official explanation, everything sounds perfectly reasonable. High temperatures can be dangerous. Dehydration can affect player health and performance. And World Cup 2026 is being played during the summer across North America. Those are facts that very few people would dispute. But if this is simply a medical precaution, why has the debate continued to grow? Why are coaches repeatedly raising questions? Why are fans reacting so strongly? And why has UEFA chosen to move in a completely different direction? That is where the central question emerges. What is really driving this story? Is it player safety? Is it the desire to create a consistent standard across the tournament? Or is something much bigger beginning to shape the future of football? Before deciding whether FIFA is right or wrong, it is important to understand the problem they are trying to solve. Because the concerns about heat at World Cup 2026 are very real. This year's tournament is being held across the United States, Canada, and Mexico during the middle of summer. Several host cities regularly experience temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius. In those conditions, players are not simply dealing with ordinary fatigue. They face the risk of serious dehydration, the risk of heat exhaustion, and in extreme cases, even heat stroke. Sports medicine experts have long warned that excessive body temperatures can directly affect athletic performance, decision-making, and overall player safety. Even before conditions become truly dangerous, dehydration alone can significantly reduce a player's ability to perform at the highest level. That is why FIFA began studying potential solutions long before the tournament started. The experience of the Club World Cup in the United States 1 year earlier only increased those concerns. Several matches were played in challenging weather conditions. Players regularly struggled with high temperatures and humidity. From that perspective, the decision to introduce additional breaks during matches does not seem unreasonable. In fact, very few people object to the goal FIFA is trying to achieve. Protecting player health is a sensible priority. No coach wants to see athletes placed at unnecessary risk. No supporter wants a match overshadowed by preventable medical emergencies. But as with many controversies in football, the issue is not the objective itself. The issue is how that objective is being implemented. And that is where the debate truly begins. The controversy began when FIFA decided to apply this rule to every match, not just a few games. Not only matches played in extreme heat, but all of them, regardless of the actual conditions on the field. According to FIFA, the reasoning was straightforward. They wanted every team to compete under the same system. If one team received a mid-match break because of hot weather, then every other team should be given the same opportunity. On paper, that argument sounds reasonable. But once the World Cup began, the first problems quickly emerged. Some matches were played at night. Some took place in relatively comfortable weather. Others were held inside modern stadiums equipped with retractable roofs and advanced climate control systems. Yet the mandatory hydration breaks still took place exactly as scheduled. That is when many people started asking questions. If the purpose of a hydration break is to reduce heat-related risks, why does it still occur in environments where those risks barely exist? The confusion spread quickly. Coaches began speaking out. Players started discussing it publicly. Fans inside stadiums began reacting as well. What is notable is that most of these voices were not opposing player safety. They were questioning the way FIFA chose to implement the policy. Because when a solution continues to be used even in situations where it does not appear necessary, people naturally begin to wonder whether the original objective is still the only reason behind it. And that was the moment the debate entered a new phase. A phase connected to something that seems to appear in nearly every major controversy in modern football: money. Up to this point, the debate had largely focused on player welfare. But then another detail began attracting attention: advertising. Only a few months after announcing the new policy, FIFA confirmed that broadcasters could use hydration breaks for commercial content. That immediately changed how many people viewed the entire situation. For the first time, a stoppage during a match was no longer only about the players. It also created a new commercial asset, a new advertising opportunity, a new source of revenue. For decades, football has been different from most major North American sports. The game flows continuously. There are no commercial interruptions between passages of play. There are no scheduled stoppages designed specifically for television. That uninterrupted rhythm has always been part of football's identity. But during World Cup 2026, many people began to feel that identity was starting to change. The referee stops the match. The cameras shift away from the action. Advertisements appear. And broadcasters gain a window of airtime they never had before. Of course, none of this proves that FIFA introduced hydration breaks because of money. There is no evidence suggesting that was the original motivation, but it does create a different problem: perception. Because in modern football, trust can be just as important as the decision itself. And when a measure introduced for health reasons quickly generates commercial benefits, skepticism becomes almost inevitable. People begin wondering whether there is more to the story than they are being told. That is why an increasing number of fans, commentators, and coaches have started asking an uncomfortable question: is the hydration break simply a tool to protect players? Or is it also a sign that the World Cup is gradually being shaped by a very different set of priorities? That question, more than the break itself, is what continues to fuel the controversy. At this point, the debate is no longer about water bottles. It is no longer about temperature either. It has started touching something much bigger: a growing concern that football is changing in ways many fans never wanted to see. For more than a century, one of football's unique strengths has been its continuity. Two halves, few interruptions, few stoppages, few moments that disrupt the natural rhythm of the match. That uninterrupted flow is what has helped set football apart from many other sports. But World Cup 2026 has created a different feeling, a feeling that matches are being divided into smaller segments. There is time for players to rest, time for coaches to adjust tactics, and time for broadcasters to make use of the pause. For some people, this is simply the evolution of modern sport, a practical response to new challenges and changing conditions. But for others, it is a sign that football is slowly moving away from the traditions that shaped its identity. What makes this especially interesting is that FIFA has never said it wants football to become a different sport. Yet many supporters are beginning to notice similarities that were not there before, not because the rules of the game have fundamentally changed, but because the way the game is presented and managed is changing, And once that feeling takes hold, the debate is no longer about a specific regulation. It becomes a debate about the future of football itself. If there was one match that perfectly illustrated this issue, it was the clash between England and Croatia. The game was played inside a modern stadium in Texas. The roof was closed. The air conditioning system was running. The temperature was being controlled almost entirely. In other words, this was exactly the type of environment FIFA was not originally worried about when discussing the dangers of extreme heat. Yet, in the 20th minute, the match still stopped. The hydration break still took place. Exactly according to procedure. Exactly according to the regulations. And that was the moment boos began to emerge from the stands. Not because fans opposed players drinking water. They reacted because they felt the reasoning behind the rule no longer matched the reality in front of them. The match quickly became the most frequently cited example in the entire debate because it exposed the biggest weakness in FIFA's approach. A rule designed for the most extreme conditions, applied to every situation, whether those conditions actually required it or not. That was also when more coaches and players began expressing similar views. They were not against protecting player health. They were not against breaks when temperatures genuinely became dangerous. But they argued that not every match is the same. Not every city is the same. And not every playing environment is the same. From that point forward, the debate started moving beyond the question of whether hydration breaks should exist at all. Instead, it evolved into a much larger question. If the reality on the ground is different from one match to another, is a one-size-fits-all rule really the best solution? While FIFA continues to defend its approach, UEFA sees the issue from a completely different perspective. What makes this especially interesting is that UEFA is not opposed to hydration breaks. It does not deny the risks that extreme temperatures can create for players. Instead, UEFA asks a much simpler question. Does a particular match actually need one? And according to UEFA, that answer should be determined by real-world data, not by a fixed rule. Under UEFA's system, match officials evaluate temperature levels and environmental conditions before making a decision. If the measurements exceed established safety thresholds, a cooling break is introduced. If they do not, the match proceeds normally. That is how the Champions League operates. And it is also how Euro 2028 is expected to operate. At first glance, the difference between FIFA and UEFA may seem minor. Both organizations want to protect players. Both acknowledge the risks created by extreme weather. But the closer you look, the clearer the divide becomes. FIFA believes consistency is the highest priority. One rule, one standard, applied to everyone. UEFA believes actual conditions should carry more weight. Each match, each stadium, each city may require a different decision. And that difference has transformed this debate into something much larger than a discussion about hydration breaks. It has become a debate between two philosophies of governance. One side prioritizes absolute consistency. The other prioritizes flexibility, guided by data. And when UEFA publicly announced that it would not follow FIFA's model, it also sent a very clear message. Europe does not believe that a single solution is automatically the right solution for every situation. If hydration breaks were the only controversy of World Cup 2026, this story probably would not have lasted very long. But the reality is that the issue emerged during a tournament already facing a long list of questions. Throughout the opening weeks of the World Cup, fans repeatedly heard debates about visas, about travel between host countries, about organizational challenges, about national teams being forced to adjust their plans because of factors completely unrelated to football. Even some individuals selected to participate in the tournament encountered difficulties during the entry process. Each of those stories, on its own, may not have been large enough to create a crisis. But when they all appear at the same time, public perception begins to shift. That is why the hydration break became more than just a regulation. It became a symbol. a symbol of the feeling that World Cup 2026 is operating in a more complicated way than many people expected. A feeling that the biggest tournament in football history is dealing with challenges that fans rarely had to think about in previous editions. And that is why the reaction to this policy has been stronger than many anticipated. Because supporters are not judging the rule in isolation. They are judging it within the context of the entire tournament. A 3-minute stoppage may not seem like a major issue by itself, but when it sits alongside other debates involving organization, logistics, and the fan experience, it begins to take on a very different meaning. It becomes part of a much larger question. Is World Cup 2026 truly delivering a better experience for everyone involved? Or is the tournament becoming increasingly complicated as its scale continues to expand? That is where the debate reaches its deepest level. It is no longer a discussion about a regulation. It is a discussion about trust. In the end, this may no longer be a story about hydration breaks at all, because very few people genuinely oppose players being allowed to drink water. Very few people oppose protecting player health. What fans are really debating is something else. Trust. Trust that every decision is being made in the best interest of the game. Trust that major changes are introduced for clear and understandable reasons. And trust that the fan experience remains a top priority. That is why this debate has not disappeared, even as FIFA continues to explain its intentions. Because when a decision creates commercial opportunities, when it generates controversy even in situations where many believe it is unnecessary, and when a major organization like UEFA chooses not to follow the same path, fans inevitably begin asking questions. Is this truly the best solution? Or is it simply the most convenient one? In modern sport, transparency has become more important than ever. It is no longer enough for a decision to be correct. People also want to understand why that decision was made. And when a gap begins to appear between the official explanation and the reality that supporters believe they are seeing, skepticism naturally follows. That is the challenge facing World Cup 2026. Not a rebellion, not a crisis, but millions of fans asking questions. And in many cases, those questions may matter more than the answers themselves. Because a tournament can survive on revenue, it can grow through technology. It can expand through innovation. But in the end, it still depends on the trust of the people who watch it. Without that trust, even the biggest competition in the world becomes much harder to defend. To be fair, it is important to remember that this is far from the first time FIFA has faced controversy. World Cup 1994 in the United States was heavily questioned before the tournament even began. Many believed football simply was not popular enough to succeed in the American market. Yet that tournament ultimately became one of the most influential World Cups in history. In 2010, South Africa faced concerns about infrastructure and security. In 2014, Brazil saw widespread protests related to the cost of hosting the tournament. In 2022, Qatar became the center of global debate for years before the opening match. And in all four cases, the World Cup still went ahead. Memorable moments were still created. Football stories ultimately became the main focus. That is why it is important to avoid overly dramatic conclusions. Hydration breaks may be controversial. Logistical challenges may be controversial. But history shows that the World Cup has often found ways to overcome problems far greater than these. At the same time, history teaches another lesson. Every World Cup leaves behind its own legacy. Every tournament is remembered for something unique. And the question right now is not whether World Cup 2026 will be successful. The real question is how it will be remembered. What story will people tell when they look back on this tournament years from now? The difference with World Cup 2026 is not a specific rule. It is not hydration breaks. And it is not UEFA. The real difference lies in the experience of the fans themselves. In the past, most World Cup controversies existed primarily at the organizational level. Fans still traveled to matches. They still watched the games. They still experience the tournament in a familiar way. But World Cup 2026 is being staged on a scale never seen before. 3 countries, 16 host cities, 104 matches. Millions of supporters have had to plan their trips months, and in many cases years, in advance. They buy tickets, reserve hotels, apply for visas, book flights. And because that level of investment is greater than ever before, every change feels more personal than ever before. When fans face travel difficulties, when they encounter rising costs, when the stadium experience changes, they feel those effects directly. That is one reason the debates surrounding World Cup 2026 have lasted longer than many expected. Because this is no longer just a story about FIFA. It is no longer just a story about UEFA. It is a story about millions of people who have invested their time, money, and emotions to be part of this tournament. And when that happens, every decision carries greater weight. Every adjustment receives closer scrutiny. And every controversy becomes more significant than it might have been in previous World Cups. At the same time, it would be unfair to view World Cup 2026 only through the lens of controversy. Because while debates may dominate the headlines, football remains at the heart of the tournament. In Mexico, stadiums continue to be packed with supporters. In Canada, the World Cup atmosphere is still creating unforgettable moments. On the pitch, goals are still being scored. Upsets are still happening. And news stories are still being written every single day. That is what has always made the World Cup different. No matter how large the controversies become off the field, the tournament is ultimately defined by the emotions that football creates. That is also why FIFA can remain confident that most fans will remember the matches far more than the debates surrounding them. But that does not mean the current questions will simply disappear. Because even if football ultimately wins, the decisions being made today could influence how future World Cups are organized for many years to come. And that is where this story truly leads. Not to a debate about a single hydration break, but to a larger discussion about what the future of the World Cup should look like. Years from now, very few people will probably remember exactly how long a hydration break lasted. Very few will remember which match sparked the first major debate. But people will remember how FIFA responded to the questions raised during World Cup 2026. Because this was never really a story about drinking water. It was a story about how the organization responsible for the world's biggest football tournament chooses to govern the game. FIFA believes consistency creates fairness. UEFA believes real-world data should guide decisions. Both arguments have logic behind them. Both can be defended. But the difference between those approaches reflects a much larger debate. What direction should football take in the future? A single system applied equally to everyone? Or a more flexible system that adapts to specific circumstances? It is entirely possible that World Cup 2026 will ultimately be remembered as the biggest tournament in football history. It is also possible that today's controversies will gradually fade from memory. But it is equally possible that this tournament will be remembered as the moment football began asking new questions about how it should be governed. Questions about balance. Questions about tradition. Questions about innovation. And questions about trust. Because in the end, the most important legacy of World Cup 2026 may not be a goal, a trophy, or even a champion. It may be the conversation it started about the future of the game itself. Years from now, very few people will remember exactly how long a hydration break lasted. Very few will remember which match sparked the first debate. But people will remember how FIFA responded to the questions that emerged during World Cup 2026. Because this was never really a story about water. It was a story about how the organization running the biggest tournament in the world chooses to govern the game. FIFA believes consistency creates fairness. UEFA believes real-world conditions should guide decisions. Both arguments have merit, but the difference between them reflects a much larger debate. What should football become in the future? A single system applied equally to everyone? Or a flexible system that adapts to specific circumstances? The debate will almost certainly continue. So what do you think? Should football prioritize absolute consistency, or should decisions be based on the realities of each individual match? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more of the biggest stories, controversies, and turning points from World Cup 2026.